The most famous of all the voodoo queens was Marie Laveau down there in Louisiana. A lot of weird, ungodly tales about Marie. She's supposed to have all sorts of potions and spells and curses. Down in Louisiana. Okay, I'm not gonna subject you guys to my singing for the first portion of this video, but that opening was the opening to a song that came out in 1974 by Bobby Bare called Marie Laveau. And as somebody who was born and raised in South Louisiana for 21 years, I've heard that song an ungodly amount, to the point where I didn't even have to look up the lyrics. I know the entire thing by heart. Now, part of the culture down in South Louisiana is definitely learning about Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen of Nolens. But, as always, a lot of the things that you learn are not necessarily the truth. I only ever learned about Marie Laveau through word of mouth, and occasionally hearing about the Marie Laveau house, which I'm fairly certain was wiped out during Katrina and then rebuilt. I never got to visit the Marie Laveau house. I didn't go by Nolens very often, only once or twice throughout my lifetime, but it is definitely a famous place and one of the places people tell you to go if you're going to go visit Nolens. And I wanted to take the time today to dive into the life of times of the real Marie Laveau and see how much of her life is related to what I learned growing up and what is actually the truth. Hi, if you don't know me, my name is Kaiser and I have a fascination with fairy tales, folklore, and history. And on this channel, we take deep dives into all of those subjects. Now, as uncomfortably weird as Bobby Bare's song is, it basically takes the life story of a real black woman and turns her into some ugly witch in the backwater swamps, and is probably a little racist, but that's not my place to speak on. One thing he did get right is Marie Laveau's notion of being the voodoo queen of Nolens. Interestingly enough, growing up, I heard the story of Marie Laveau that goes like this. Marie was not actually a voodoo practitioner. In fact, she was a good Christian woman. She was a hairdresser in downtown New Orleans, and a lot of the times she would hear gossip from the ladies who would sit in her chair, and so she would take that gossip and she would spread it around the town. Often accused of being a witch for knowing the deepest secrets of the townsfolk, one day they all rose up, attempted to burn her house to the ground and hang her out of the third-story window. As Marie was dying, she shouted out a curse to the entirety of Nolens that her house would always stand and her ghost would always haunt them. We're going to find a lot of problems with that story today, but I want you to keep that in the back of your mind because that is the story that I always heard. And up until I started researching this, that is the story that I assumed was about her life. Born September 8th, 1801, Marie Catherine Laveau was born a free black woman in the French Quarter of Nolens. She was born to her mother, who was also a free black woman named, and I'm sure I'm going to mess this up, Marguerite d'Arcantel. Now, unfortunately, we are not sure who Marie's father is because we do know his name was Charles Laveau, but there are two Charles Laveau back then. The first is a white nobleman, Charles Laveau, spelled L-A-V-E-A-U, and the second one was a free black carpenter named Charles Laveau, L-A-V-E-A-U-X. The reason we're not sure which one of these Charles Laveaus was her father was because of inconsistencies with spelling to both her name and her father's name throughout historical records. In March of 1819, Marie was married to a man named Jacques Paris, who was a quadroon man of color who fled the Haitian Revolution in the former French colony of Saint-Dominique. They were both married for only 1 year. Their union ended up birthing two daughters, Félicité in 1817 and Angela in 1820. And unfortunately, Jacques perished in 1820 from undisclosed events. Now, interestingly enough as well, the two daughters that she originally had, all records of them have vanished after the 1820s. And I think that this is the first step into understanding how reality can be twisted into legend and lore. Knowing that Marie was considered to be a voodoo priestess by a lot of the press at the time, it can be very easily twisted that she was some sort of evil witch who sacrificed her daughters and her husband to some kind of, I don't know, whatever, right? I think voodoo has gods. I'm not too familiar with voodoo. How does a Cajun not know much about voodoo? I'm just not, guys. I never studied voodoo.
So I don't really know too much about it, and I'm not going to speak on something I don't know. But the point is that the shift in understanding between who Marie Laveau actually was and the myth that has been built about this powerful voodoo witch is very easy to understand how it happened, because historical records can disappear quite easily. We actually don't know as much about history as we claim to, because a lot of times papers get destroyed, they get lost, they get mistranslated, and so this is just one of those things that probably acted as a stepping stone to creating the myth and legend that was the Voodoo Queen. Now, shortly after the death of her first husband, Marie entered a domestic partnership with, and this is going to be a mouthful here, so bear with me, Christophe Dominique Dominique de Glapion, a French nobleman, and he and her were together until his death in 1855. Between the two of them, they ended up birthing 15 children. Now, I am not going to name all of these children and their birth dates and everything, because if I attempted to pronounce half of the names that I found, my tongue would attempt to jump out of my throat. But what I will tell you is that unfortunately, only 2 of these children lived to adulthood, and only 1 actually outlived Marie herself. Now, the first confliction that I ended up finding while I was doing research was actually about the fact that Marie was known to go and visit prisoners that were on death row. She would go and she would perform Catholic rituals with them so that they could make their peace with God before they would go to the gallows. And even her granddaughter confirmed that these were all strictly Catholic practices. So where did the idea that she was a voodoo priestess come from? We'll get to that a little bit later, but for now, I will tell you that while she was visiting these prisoners, there was a lot of rumors that she would bring them potions and ointments that would be there to help calm the prisoners and let them move on to the next life, which was very anti-Catholic, to be honest. But I wanted to read you this article out of the New Orleans Republican that was published in 1871. This is just a passage from the article. It says, "The prisoners were also indebted to the kind offices of Madame Marie Laveau. An aged woman with her grandchildren provided the chapel adjoining the condemned cell with the appropriate symbols, apartaming the altar of the Catholic Church. This good Christian woman, who has been erroneously described by a portion of the press as a voodoo priestess, is in reality a devout and acceptable member of the Catholic communion, and has, for 40 years, devoted herself to Christian ministrations for those whom the law has condemned to die." And to be honest with you, as I was doing this research, I was incredibly confused. And the reason for that is because I couldn't find anything outside of this mention of the press that she was a voodoo priestess. So it started to kind of meld into my mind, was it possible that Marie had nothing to do with voodoo, and instead the story of her being a voodoo priestess was contrived by the white America of the time? They saw this free black woman who maybe they were not very happy with, doing all sorts of things that were meant to help the community, and instead they wanted to twist and create this evilness that they assumed she was doing. Interestingly enough, the article was published in 1871, and they said for 40 years. That means that Marie was doing it since her early 30s. She had been known as a devout Christian. So, realistically speaking, where did this voodoo stuff come from? Well, as it turns out, the deeper that I dug and the more that I started reading things like biographies and books, it was her early life where she was known as a voodoo practitioner. And it did indeed go into her later life. It's just that she was able to separate the two. There's this religion called Catholic folklore that she was said to have participated in, which combined elements of Catholicism with other spirituality type things. This was mostly a compromise between pagans and Christians to allow pagans to continuously exist while calling their practices Catholicism. If you want to know a little bit more about this, then one of my favorite YouTuber, Kaz Rowe, has released a video about the era of burning witches, where they talk a lot more about how paganism and Catholicism started to meld together. But I don't think that's what happened with Marie Laveau. I think instead she just learned how to separate the two practices, because as it turns out, she did own a beauty parlor. She was also a healer and an herbalist. Marie Laveau was very well known for being one of the best hairdressers, which wealthy white women would regularly go to her salon. women, and she would hear gossip from those women and from the slaves and servants who would go to pay her, or from the slaves and servants who she would have to heal because not many doctors would work on them. And this brings up an interesting point. Marie Laveau was loved. She was very beloved. As we'll find out a little bit later, Marie Laveau was actually one of those people who everybody cared for. So this idea that she was some evil woman with which everybody was scared of the voodoo priestess doesn't really fit, because even the wealthy whites of Nolens would go to her. They would go to her and they would get potions and ailments and spells for their finances or their love lives or their family issues. This was a very common thing that people would do during the time that Marie was alive. And all the way up until her death, she was seen as basically the town healer. She was someone people loved and cared about. And it really confuses me how we built this idea that she was an evil, powerful witch, when instead she was more benevolent than anything. In fact, voodoo was not as looked down upon as a lot of people say it was, because she was the leader of the voodoo sect. There were other practitioners of voodoo during this time in New Orleans. It was something that was very commonplace and not at all hunted out by mobs with burning torches. And I'm starting to see a lot of similarities between the Salem witch trial era and Marie Laveau. There's this idea that there was this time where everybody who wasn't a Christian was needlessly hunted down in the 1800s and burned at the stake and all of these things. But in fact, that's not what happened at all. On June 17th, 1881, Marie passed away peacefully in her home of natural causes. She was just shy of her 80th birthday, and her funeral was lavish and diverse. It was said that people came from other places to join in and come and look at the woman who was the most loved person in the town. One of the biggest things about Marie's life was that she healed anybody who wanted to be healed. She cared for anyone who wanted to be cared. Even when she was very close to her death in 1878, she was known to care for people during the yellow fever outbreak, which was an outbreak that caused over 40% of Louisiana's population to flee, and by the end of it, killed over 20,000 people. Even through that kind of sickness, that kind of pain, Marie was still there to care for people. And so it's not a wonder that in her death, so many people cared for Marie. So many people wanted to see who she was and honor her memory. This idea of this woman who was a secret witch is just never stated in her actual history, nor do the way that people treated her before and after her death back this up. It seems that some of the people in the press during her lifetime maybe took her voodoo practitioners ways as something to call her an evil person, but it seems that a lot of people were able to contend with the fact that she was both a devout Catholic woman who died with a faith in heaven, as is quoted in many of her biographies, and was also someone who believed in the practices of voodoo. To this day, Marie is buried in the plot 347 of the Glapian family crypt, although this has been disputed by one person, a journalist by the name of Robert Tallant, and yeah, you can see why I really don't believe him, maybe. Now, one last thing that I want to cover is the rumor of ghosts at the Marie Laveau house. And while I haven't been to visit it, I do want you guys to understand that the Marie Laveau house has been rebuilt. It was knocked down during Katrina, and it did get rebuilt, and it's nowhere near what it used to be. Also, upon my research, and I could be wrong about this, but I'm fairly certain I read somewhere that that isn't even what her house originally was. Her house was not a 3-story place in the French Quarter. It was actually a single-story house, but I don't know too much about that. I couldn't find too much evidence to back that up, so I wouldn't take that at face value. So if you go to the Marie Laveau house, don't expect to see any ghostly visages of her wandering around, but it is still apparently a very cool place to visit. It's got a lot of knickknacks, it's got a lot of history lessons, and I suggest you guys do go and delve into that. And please, if you're going to go visit Marie Laveau's tomb, we ask that you be respectful of it, as there is a tradition of drawing 3 red X's and then knocking on the tomb and then asking for Marie to grant your wish. And let's just not defile dead people's tombs, guys. That's just not something we should be doing. But always remember that whenever you hear about someone who was apparently an evil witch or an evil person that everybody despised, perhaps it's always best to go back and look at the real history and make sure that the truth does line up. Because like I said, I grew up hearing a much more gruesome and terrifying story that didn't even turn out to be true. Not even like remotely. Like the hairdresser thing was true, but nobody hated her. Nobody hung her from the 3rd story. Nobody tried to burn her fucking house down. She was a loved and cared for individual. And to this day, I really hope that her descendants are living their best life knowing that their great grandmother was known as one of the kindest people in New Orleans. And she was known as the Voodoo Queen. But that's all I have for you guys today. If you like fairy tales, folklore, and old history, be sure to hit that sub button down below. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so if you want to be part of that, we'd really love to have you. And yeah, I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one.